Back when I was in seminary, I took a survey course on Eastern religious traditions, learning about Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and Shinto primarily. There was a hint of Hinduism there at the very beginning of the class, but the tradition that most captured my attention was Taoism. And I remember my final paper was about the difference between the grand traditional gardens of Europe and the traditional gardens in China and Japan. The difference in the gardens illustrates a key difference in the worldview between the East and the West. Traditional European gardens are all straight lines and rows, manicured box-shaped bushes, and flowers in matching colors. Traditional Japanese gardens, on the other hand, are echoes of the natural world brought into cities and homes. They are asymmetrical. They feature rocks and water along with the various plants. When a gardening style rises to the level of being considered traditional, it is in part because the garden represents something about the culture and how the people see themselves. Where traditional European gardens are meant to be seen as an improvement on nature, traditional Japanese gardens are considered an interpretation of nature. In our Western philosophy, the natural world is seen as something that must be stewarded, improved upon, and controlled. It's a resource or an obstacle. But in Eastern philosophy, Taoist philosophy in particular, the natural world is in balance already, and our goal is to emulate it, to learn to be in balance as well. It is perhaps fair to say that they are both seeking a balance, but the balance of the European garden is static, with sharp lines, while the Japanese garden, that balance is dynamic and reflective of the natural world. So this more dynamic form of balance is a key theme in Taoism. And in a playful way, it is exemplified by the story of Poohsticks, which we heard just a few minutes ago. Lao Tzu is the first teacher of Taoism, the author of the book, the Tao Te Ching. The first chapter of the Tao Te Ching states, "The Tao that can be expressed is not the true Tao. The name that can be named is not the true name." This first stanza of ineffability it has confounded and enlightened countless people through the centuries. And it is a central theme throughout the text. A second theme, the theme that is my focus this morning, is of balance. In the second chapter, we hear about a series of polarities. If you're familiar with the text, you already know this. When we know about beauty, we become aware of the ugly. When we understand one thing to be good, that naturally means that another thing is wicked, long and short, high and low, before and after. The first two stanzas of this chapter carefully delineate the relationships that make up our living. And then it says this: "That's why the wise soul does without doing, teaches without talking. The things of this world exist. They are. We can't refuse them. To bear and not to own, to act and not lay claim, to do the work and let it go. For just letting it go is what makes it stay." So in Taoist philosophy, the goal of life, the grand purpose, is balance. So much of our living is out of balance. The wise soul, we read, seeks to maintain and even restore balance. And there is a nuanced way to understand what is meant by this Taoist idea of balance. Toward that end, the wise soul, as it says in chapter 2 of the Tao Te Ching, does without doing. Wu-Wei are the characters as we transliterate. How does one do without doing? This Chinese phrase, translated as Wu-Wei, and the literal translation is, as we heard in the reading, not doing. But the tone of the phrase is still about doing something. It's not inaction. It's not doing nothing. Many translators have used the English phrase effortless action to indicate this phrase. It highlights how the action is not being forced or pushed. Another way to think of it is to use the difference between a European garden and a Japanese garden. Both involve quite a bit of work. But one style forces nature into unnatural forms, while the other is an interpretation along natural lines. Philosopher and author Benjamin Huff writes, literally, Wu-Wei means without doing, causing, or making, but practically speaking, it means without meddlesome, combative, or egotistical effort. In his popular book, The Tao of Pooh, Benjamin Huff argues that A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh character is an example of Taoist practice. Pooh accomplishes a lot throughout the stories, but he mostly stumbles into the solutions. He's just being Pooh. Milne makes Rabbit clever and Piglet anxious and Tigger incorrigible. Pooh just sails through the stories, not really doing anything, and yet that is his charm. In our reading this morning, Daniel Bork titles his piece The Art of Not Forcing, and he uses that distinction between rowing and sailing to make the point. While the rower uses effort, the sailor uses magic. And when he says magic, he means the way the sailor does not push or force the boat to move. Instead, he arranges for the wind to move the boat. Wu-Wei is still an action, but it's an action that does not push or force or run counter to the natural world. It seeks to move along natural lines. I think this is a difficult idea. I think most of us don't really think about things like this, doing without doing, effortless action. So what does it look like in our lives? In the Tao Te Ching, the concept is often applied most directly to leadership, to being the ruler of a country. The text often refers to kings and princes and the people. The best rulers do not impose or force people to be a certain way. Instead, they assure that the people are not hungry. That actually comes up in the text a couple of times. Or think of this in terms of other leadership roles, such as being a parent, or a supervisor, or a teacher. Maybe you are the president of a board, or the chair of a department. Maybe you're the point person, or the lead on a project or a campaign. Whatever it is, where you get to make the decisions that can impact not only yourself, but other people as well. A role in which you wield some power. The Tao Te Ching is really all about power when you dig into it. So how can we apply these ideas of the Tao and Wu-Wei to your leadership role and to the places where you have some power that you might wield? Is there a natural wholeness and balance that you can promote? Are there choices you can make that will enhance the lives of people? Remember, the goal is not to do nothing. It's to offer effortless action. In the Japanese garden, the goal is not to let the space just go wild. It is to craft an interpretation of nature as your garden. To shape a space along natural lines that reflects the dynamic balance of the natural world. Can you shape a space where the power you wield is a dynamic balance along the natural lines of the world? And here I'll circle back to a small moment in the reading from Daniel Bork and the analogy of rowing and sailing. And perhaps you heard this acknowledgement that one could still row when needed. To approach everything with Wu-Wei, to not force, to let it happen, he wrote. To put up the sail and ride the wind, he wrote, but to row if you need to. Because even effort can be applied effortlessly when you know the grand source. So this isn't an either-or conversation. It's a relax a little bit conversation. Another author, Stephen Jopich, also lifts up the warning against seeing Wu-Wei as non-action or surrender even. Jopich says that Wu-Wei advises us to give up on forcing things, not that we give up altogether. For instance, he writes, when you're experiencing injustice, Wu-Wei doesn't suggest resignation. It is quite the opposite. Wu-Wei suggests a persistent amount of pressure. This pressure isn't a metaphorical jackhammer or wrecking ball. It is a soft strike on the right spot. It's like water, quietly working through the toughest cliffs and rocks. Taoism does return to the metaphor of water quite a bit. In chapter 66 and in 78, it talks about water as a model for how to be in the world. Bruce Lee has a great quote about being like water. Be like water making its way through the cracks. He said, do not be assertive, but adjust to the object, and you shall find a way around or through it. But perhaps the best example of this is from Chuang Tzu, a Chinese philosopher from 2,500 years ago, a Taoist, whose importance to the founding of Taoism is considered second only to Lao Tzu. Chuang Tzu offers this story. There is a great waterfall and a turbulent river, and a wise teacher was watching the water one day, and he saw an old man being tossed about in the water. And the teacher called to his disciples, and together they rushed down to the river to help the man, though they feared that there was little they could do. By the time they reached the water's edge, the old man had already climbed out onto the bank and was walking along singing to himself. Shocked and in a little bit of awe, the teacher inquired of the old man, what secret power do you have? The old man laughed it off and said, I go down with the water and I come up with the water. I follow it and forget myself. I survive because I don't struggle against the water's superior power. That's all. That's all. In another chapter of Winnie the Pooh, in which Christopher Robin leads an expedition to the North Pole, one character has a very similar experience. Christopher Robin takes everyone along on an expedition to discover the North Pole. They pack provisions and they head out together in a line. And eventually they stop for lunch on a nice grassy spot by the stream. And everyone, after everyone is finished with their eating, a scene unfolds that is strikingly similar to that of Chuang Tzu's old man in the river. Piglet is lying on his back, sleeping peacefully. Roo is washing his face and paws in the stream. Well, Kanga explained to everyone proudly that this was the first time he had ever washed his face himself. And Owl was telling Kanga an interesting anecdote full of long words like encyclopedia and rhododendron, to which Kanga wasn't listening. I don't hold with all this washing, grumbled Eeyore, this modern behind-the-ears nonsense. What do you think, Pooh? Well, said Pooh, I think, but we shall never know what Pooh thought, for there was a sudden squeak from Roo and a splash, and a loud cry of alarm from Kanga. So much for washing, said Eeyore. Roo's fallen in, cried Rabbit, and he and Christopher Robin came rushing down to the rescue. Look, I'm swimming, squeaked Roo from the middle of his pool, and was hurried down a waterfall to the next pool. Are you all right, Roo dear? Called Kanga anxiously. Yes, said Roo, look at me swim. And down he went over the next waterfall into another pool. Everyone was doing something to help. Piglet, wide awake suddenly, was jumping up and down and making, oh, I say, noises. Owl was explaining, in a case of sudden and temporary immersion, the important thing is to keep the head above water. Kanga was jumping along the bank saying, "Are you sure you're all right, Roo, dear?" To which Roo, from whichever pool he was in at the moment, was answering, "Look at me swimming!" Eeyore had turned around and hung his tail over the first pool into which Roo fell, and with his back to the accident was grumbling quietly to himself and saying, "All this washing, but catch on to my tail, little Roo, and you'll be all right." And Christopher Robin and Rabbit were hurrying past Eeyore and were calling to the others in front of them. "It's all right, Roo, I'm coming," Christopher Robin said. "Get something across the stream lower down, some of you fellows," cried Rabbit. But Pooh was getting something. 2 pools below Roo, he was standing with a long pole in his paw, and Kanga came up and took the other end, and between them they held it across that lower part of the pool. And Roo, still bubbling proudly, "Look at me swimming," drifted up against it and climbed out. "Did you see me swimming?" squeaked Roo excitedly, while Kanga scolded him and rubbed him down. "Pooh, did you see me swimming? That's called swimming. That's what I was doing." "Rabbit, did you see what I was doing?" "Swimming." "Hello, Piglet." "I say, Piglet, what do you think I was doing?" "Swimming." "Christopher Robin, did you see me?" But Christopher Robin wasn't listening. He was looking at Pooh. "Pooh," he said, "where did you find that pole?" Pooh looked at the pole in his hands. "Oh, I just found it," he said. "I thought it ought to be useful. I just picked it up." "Pooh," said Christopher Robin solemnly, "the expedition is over. You have found the North Pole." "Oh," said Pooh. Effortless action. Pooh was not trying to find the North Pole. He was just trying to help Roo. If you have some power, some role in which you have an impact on the lives of others, use it with, I would say, compassion. Use it in a way that will enhance the natural way of things. Or, as the Tao Te Ching keeps saying it, use it to be sure people are not hungry. May we learn the difficult art of acting in ways that are true to our nature and in balance with the natural world. May we always seek for the true nature of others to blossom and grow. When we see injustice or cruelty, may we recognize it as imbalance and seek to offer guidance and correction to restore balance rather than to add more harm. May we learn to do without doing, teach without talking, act without laying claim. May we do the work and let it go, and then do the work again tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. Each day doing our part to restore balance to our too often broken and unbalanced lives. In a world without end, may it be so. Let us join in singing our closing hymn, Blessed